Thank you for watching, and welcome back to another brand new episode of The Completionist. Now, before you guys freak out, I'm actually in Norway for the national holiday and for a convention called Retrospillmisen. That's why I don't have my set or my things here, and I love Norway so far. It's been super fun hanging out with a bunch of my YouTube buddies, and that's why I'm not at the set. So if you're in Norway, come to the convention this weekend. I'll see you there. So one Nintendo franchise that I've neglected for quite a while has been Fire Emblem. I never played the original on the NES or any of the sequels, and it wasn't until I think the 7th and 6th game, I think it's the 6th game, where it finally came out here in the States.
It's the 7th game. It's actually hey, what's up? I'm lighting this scene with a hotel lamp. It was the 7th game in the series. It's called Fire Emblem the Blazing Sword in Japanese.
They just called it Fire Emblem.
It was the prequel. It was the
prequel to the one on the NES.
It was the prequel. It was a sequel, but it was a prequel. Does that make sense? It was a sequel that was the prequel.
You just want to explain it to the camera real quick?
Advance Wars was really successful over here.
Let's begin.
Yes! Fight!
You know, it's crazy to think about how radically Nintendo history was changed by a game with as silly as a premise as Super Smash Bros., right? It sold a ton of GameCubes, Wiis, 3DSs, and Wii U, sure, but would you also believe that it almost single-handedly finally helped bring the Fire Emblem series to the States too? I mean, it didn't hurt that Advanced Wars was a surprise out of nowhere hit either, to help convince Nintendo that us Westerners were finally ready for more complex RPGs, even though, let's be honest, we had been for years. But tell me this, did you know where Roy and Marth were from before they showed up in Melee? No? Me neither. And without 14-year-old Gerard deciding to quote-unquote try out this weird sword guy for once in my quest to quote-unquote complete it, I never would have even looked him up, much less actually played through a big chunk of one of the games in the series with Fire Emblem Awakening. And since then, even though I haven't really had the time to finally go balls deep into some hardcore Japanese SRPG goodness, as the ads in Nintendo Power once said, okay, there were never any ads that said that, I always thought this series looked really awesome, and always kind of wistfully admired it from afar. Like when you're at a zoo, and you get to see that rich family pet the monkeys from the other side of the glass. But when people talk about how challenging they all are, and how sad it is when your party members die, it's like watching one of the monkeys throw poop in the little rich girl's hair, and suddenly I'm glad I never tried to complete one. At least until now. Today, Fire Emblem Echoes is out, and it looks really fun. I'm a total sucker for that retro art style, and you know what they say, monkey see, monkey do, or in this case, monkey do. Yeah, I went there. That was low, I'm sorry. Very low-hanging fruit, I went there. Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance was released in 2002, and since then we've had tons of other Fire Emblem games released here in the States. But what a lot of people don't realize is that even before that, this series had a huge and storied history on the other side of the Pacific, taking us all the way back to the Famicom days with the original 1990 release, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. I'm not really sure why it took Nintendo 12 years and 6 Japanese-only releases to finally give it a try out here, but I imagine that a lot of it had to do with just what kind of game Fire Emblem is. Being a strategy RPG rather than the much more popular turn-based titles like Final Fantasy and Dragon Warrior meant that much of the game takes place on static battlefields, and in exchange for a more complex battle system and richer character relationships, the story in Fire Emblem largely plays out with static character sprites and boxes and boxes and boxes of text, which can be difficult for some players. players. And that's probably what made Nintendo nervous to take a chance on the game, in a region where most people preferred more active games they could learn along the way without having to spend too much time thinking about them first. Not to mention the notoriously unforgiving permadeath mechanic the series is known for, where at any given point, even the slightest mistake can cost you a character you spent hours leveling up and getting to know. And unless you reset the game and restart the chapter you're on from the very beginning, that means they're gone forever. Honestly, this kinda makes sense. And I know a lot of you out there still feel this way about trying out a super hardcore RPG franchise for the first time. But at the same time, there's a whole other set of people out there, myself included, who eat JRPGs each morning for breakfast and loved what Intelligent Systems did with Advance Wars. They're also big fans of Roy and Marth in Smash, and for once, Nintendo actually localized the GBA game we wanted and not the much worse NES prequel that practically no one asked for. In 2003, they dropped the subtitled The Blazing Blade from the series' second Game Boy Advance release, which was the 7th in the series overall, and officially put it out in the West as simply Fire Emblem. It was a commercial success, no, a critical success. It got Fire Emblem started out on the path to where it is today, and I couldn't be more excited to finally properly jump in. Fire Emblem for the GBA is made up of 3 separate stories. First is a short tutorial campaign for new players featuring Lyn. Then comes a meaty main story centered around Eliwood, who's actually the father of Roy. And then, once you finish the game proper, you get Hector's Tale, which is kind of like a more challenging remix of Eliwood's story, except centered around his friend Hector's point of view. It's basically the same thing, but with some new dialogue, a couple of extra chapters, and fresh enemy troop placement. But for my completionist purposes, it's kind of important because it also has exclusive recruitable characters and items. There's also support conversations, a couple of different variations on the ending, and some music and images to unlock. But far and away, the thing that I'm most worried about is that when I finish a campaign, it unlocks that campaign's hard mode version with higher level enemies, better enemy AI, and even less available unit slots in certain missions. We already know this franchise isn't for the faint of heart, and for a first-time player especially, Fire Emblem for Game Boy Advance is seriously a tough game. Playing through the whole thing at least 4 times non-stop isn't gonna be easy. But if it is gonna be super hard, I hope at least that it's fair, engaging, and fun. Not that I'm worried, exactly. Nintendo has a great track record, and if this Fire Emblem is as good as everyone says it is, it might even convince me to dust off my old copy of Awakening and finish that up. Who knows? Gotta ship my army. Anyways, let's talk about the Legend of Fire Emblem. Depending on how deeply you want to dive into the characters of Fire Emblem, the game has a story that's simultaneously simple and complex. It's a prequel to the last game in the series, The Binding Blade, where Roy was introduced. And while there are some story threads that carry over, most notably the appearance of Prince Zephiel and the fact that Eliwood and Hector are the fathers of Roy and Linnea, it also stands completely on its own to the point that if, like most of us in the West, you only know Roy from Smash, it doesn't impact your enjoyment of this game at all. Both games take place on the continent of Eliby, where 1,000 years ago, humans and dragons used to be cool with each other and live together in harmony. But then the humans started being jerks, and in a terrible war called the Scouring, where 8 heroes came together to cast the dragons out, dragons eventually vanished from the world altogether. But when Fire Emblem kicks off, this is already in the distant past, and before they even get into any of the classic JRPG world-ending chosen hero stuff, Fire Emblem introduces us to the Tactician, a character who acts as your first-person surrogate in the Fire Emblem world, and who's just met Lyn, a girl who just lost her family at the hands of a gang of bandits. Also, the Tactician's name is just Mark for some reason, and while Mark is a fine name, it also kind of sounds like that dude who lives in your apartment building or something, so I kind of felt like I had to bring it up. Sorry to all the Marks out there. I love you guys. Eventually, Lyn discovers she's the long-lost heir to the throne of a kingdom called Caelin, and the majority of Lyn's tale is about her getting a group together so she can try and save her grandfather Hausen, the sitting Marquess, for being betrayed by his murderous brother Lundgren. It's a nice little slow burn, and even though it serves mainly as a way to string together 10 simple tutorial missions for new players who may not be familiar with how this game's battle system works, I actually found myself getting pretty emotional at parts. I appreciate that well fleshed out characters are the hallmark of a great Fire Emblem game, and the way this one kind of tricks you into accepting a form of storytelling focused on dialogue-heavy cutscenes with almost no movement by basically framing it as a character mission from Mass Effect 2 was really fun, and it made me mind an excruciatingly long and hand-holding tutorial much less. Which was nice, especially since in a game like this, a tutorial is almost kind of necessary, right? How else are you gonna learn how everything works? Also, as a side note, I totally loved Sane. He was a great version of a hopelessly vain knight character, and the harmless and almost pitiful way he imagined himself to be the village Lothario made him a super fun character to chat with. And really, this might not be everyone's bag, but with a cast as huge as Fire Emblem's, I feel like there's probably a character like this for everyone. Except you, Ted.
What? Why me?
Well, let's put it like this. What do you look for in a good Fire Emblem character?
Well, I'd probably have to say, like, long giraffe neck, rainbow hair, and a Spanish accent. What?
Exactly. After that is the main story, Eliwood's Tale, which has you teaming up with the heirs of the other two kingdoms, Eliwood from Foray and Hector from Ostia, to take on a group of assassins called the Black Fang, whose leader Nergal not only uses magic to create mindless slave warriors, but also wants to open up something called a Dragon's Gate to plunge the whole world into chaos. Eventually, Lyn joins back up with you two, and between the four of you and the small army you raise, it's your job to save the day. On the one hand, this seems pretty cut and dry, but that's because unlike the vague emotional nonsense of Final Fantasy and the lighthearted charm of Dragon Quest, Fire Emblem has an overarching plot that remains serious while also being easy to follow along with, so that the depth of the conversations between characters can really shine through. You'll always hear critics of the series saying that these games have a lot of boring talking in them, and while I wouldn't really call it boring myself, there is a lot of it, and admittedly, that's not really my kind of thing, but to say that all this dialogue is useless couldn't be farther from the truth. Even though world-changing things are constantly happening and the fate of the world hangs in the balance, the game engine doesn't allow for much movement or visual spectacle the way other GBA games like Metroid Fusion or Mother 3 might, and it ends up kind of feeling like you were watching an opera or a puppet show or something instead of a movie. It's really melodramatic and overly complex in a way a lot of current anime and visual novels are, and to me, that's not a bad thing at all. It just speaks to a different type of storytelling. Until much more recently, games didn't really have the technical power to achieve this visually, and back in the day, Fire Emblem got around this limitation by making its games feel less like a novel and more like a history lesson that came to life when you're the general guiding the troops. It's weird to say, but it almost feels like immersion comes less from the story and more from the gameplay and presentation. Don't believe me? Look at the battle screen right here. Fire Emblem has some of the most beautifully animated sprite work on the Game Boy Advance. Just look how badass these sword moves look. And the soundtrack is one of the only ones I've heard on the console that never once reminded me of how bad its sound chip is. The dialogue exists to give you good background and context for the action that plays out on the battlefield. But until you actually see your troops get decimated by some big dude with a huge spear firsthand and realize that if they die, they're gone forever, you don't really feel like you're in it. So then you get these highly stressful battles and these super chill cutscenes, punctuated by a bunch of interesting side missions and some great little conversations that you get to see when certain units earn high enough of a support rating with each other. And in the end, through this totally different storytelling method, you're left with some of the most believable and well-developed RPG characters in the genre. It's all pretty cool stuff. And you know me, I'm a sucker for a really well done, straight up good guy character. So I'm probably going to love playing Fire Emblem. It's full of them. Still, that said, no game is perfect, and this one is not without its problems. The most glaring being that the map itself, which you stare at for the majority of your time with the game, is pretty darn ugly and almost kind of sloppy, especially when compared to the absolutely perfect looking battle sprites. Look at how some of these rock walls don't even make sense. What are these textures? It's a bummer when something really dramatically significant happens in the story and the poor quality of the landscape and the overworld sprites make it hard for me to take it seriously. with its weird little two-color Pokemon look and the weird synchronized dance everyone does. It just looks like a bunch of GIFs hanging out. But then I'll hear that Fire Emblem theme, which is awesome. Maybe I'll bust out some sweet maneuver and the enemy plays right into my hands. Perhaps I just narrowly beat a scary boss. It all kind of made me realize that superficial problems like this barely make a mark on my largely positive first playthrough of this game overall. Maybe some of you don't understand if you didn't grow up with the GBA. Games on the GBA rarely ever felt huge, and for that, I have to give Fire Emblem props. Props is such a weird word to use nowadays. Props. When I think of props, I think of like film props or stage props, but like when someone's like, yo, mad props, they're gonna like hand you a fish or a gun or something? I don't know. What do you think of?
I would like a fish.
You want a fish prop?
Yeah.
Get Brett a fish pop, someone. A fish pop.
I don't want a fish pop.
No, a fish prop. The actual gameplay of Fire Emblem is definitely its most distinguishing feature, and most people who've tried it either really hate it or really love it. But just in case you've been living under a rock for the past 25 years, here's the basic gist. Fire Emblem is a strategic battle simulation / role-playing game. There's a grid on screen made of different types of tiles that represents the battlefield and everything on it. You bring an army, and so does your opponent, and instead of taking turns back and forth with an enemy every time a unit moves, your turn isn't over until you've done one or two things with every unit you want to. It feels like a really exciting high-stakes version of chess that you're playing while also watching a Game of Thrones episode. And while that's the nerdiest English majory thing I could ever imagine, there's a reason why there's a million of these damn games and why Nintendo still's about to go all in with it today, decades later. It's fun, simple as that. And you know, at first, after being blown away by Awakening a few years ago, I was actually pretty worried that going back to try an older entry in the series on less modern hardware was going to be a challenge for me, especially because it was supposed to be so damn hard. But don't worry though, if you're like me and you fell in love with this series for the first time on the 3DS, there's actually a lot of things that feels familiar. First of all, the rock, paper, scissors style weapon triangle is here, and actually, with the slightly less cramped map design, having to position your troops to account for swords beating axes, axes beating lances, and lances beating swords was a pretty interesting little mechanic. Also included are weapon proficiencies, character leveling, the ability to change classes once you hit level 10, and even though romance options and the ability to pair up units wasn't introduced until later on, the support system based around positioning units next to other units they work well with is legitimately useful and gets super fun. Once you realize the game not only rewards you for doing this with stat buffs, but also neat little bits of story in the form of support conversations, this can get pretty addicting pretty fast without really feeling overwhelming, especially when you're not trying to complete the game as quickly as possible. It's nice to always have something new to try and uncover, even if it's small. Just like with any Fire Emblem, there's also plenty of items and gear to buy between battles and from secret shops hidden on the battlefields, as well as extra characters and side missions which can be unlocked by satisfying certain conditions, like talking to an enemy with the correct friendly unit, visiting the right village on the map, or completing a mission in under a certain amount of turns. Now, for the average Fire Emblem fan, all this stuff seems pretty awesome, right? Who wouldn't want a game that rewards you with new stuff to discover every time you play through it? But for me, a guy who has to get through everything in a week or two's time, this got pretty freaking insane pretty quickly, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. And beyond that, while adding random elements to the game was probably mostly a good idea to mix up for players on multiple playthroughs, the fact that there's no way to predict stat gains is kind of a huge pain, to the point that when you level up and all of your characters get is a couple of points of HP, I wanted to really cry and reset the game. And the same thing goes for the AI. Generally, the AI is pretty solid, and as you play through the game at harder difficulties, it gets even better. But for me, when RNGesus chooses to punish me for my wicked ways by causing some scary NPC to move some crazy random way and crit one of my dudes to death out of nowhere, it can mess up with the formation you've been working on for hours across multiple resets already, which is frustrating to no end. You know, on the one hand, I get it. all is fair in love and war. And if I'm not prepared for a few surprises, that's on me. But for a game that's all about having to restart a whole chapter whenever you mess up, why are there so many ways for that to happen that are out of my control? I get that it's supposed to be a hardcore experience, but that shouldn't also mean it's tedious, right? Because that's not really fun. Okay, maybe I shouldn't get too ahead of myself, because on the whole, Fire Emblem was surprisingly fun, especially on that first playthrough. The tactics and strategy really do work most of the time, and unlike a lot of strategy RPGs, it really felt like every tool I had was at my disposal and was useful. And it wasn't until I had to grind super hard in my later playthroughs that anything stopped feeling dangerous. And I really do mean that. From the biggest bosses to the lowliest morph, I was one-shotted or critted to within inches of certain doom by almost every type of enemy unit in the game at least once. And yet, for some reason, I didn't totally hate it. The stakes are higher in Fire Emblem than in most RPGs. And in a strategy game especially, that really keeps you thinking, focused, and engaged. And now, I guess this is where I talk about permadeath. From a story standpoint, I love the idea of permadeath. The fact that no one is safe and that if you're not careful, that character you love could be wiped out at any given moment. That's practically Fire Emblem in a nutshell. But from a gameplay perspective, I'm a little bit more on the fence. I get that it's tradition and everything, and at this point, resetting the game into strategy RPG is practically expected. But I just played a buttload of Fire Emblem, and if I told you I loved going back and replaying stuff tons of times just because one unit died that I didn't expect to, I'd just be lying. And I know a lot of you out there probably disagree with me, and you're gonna go online and tell me how disappointed you are that I don't have the exact same opinion as you about this 15-year-old GBA game, but at the very least, I know that I'm not crazy, because when Fire Emblem Awakening came out, they added a casual mode so that people who want to just enjoy the experience and the story without having to play chapters over and over again finally could. And as someone who can see why permadeath is both awesome and terrible, I really did miss it when this Fire Emblem didn't give me that choice. So in the end, what's the deal? Is Fire Emblem a fun game? Absolutely. Is Fire Emblem a perfect game? Not by a long shot. But is this game good enough that it's worth playing despite its faults, even in 2017? I'm no expert, but I do complete a lot of games, and at least on that authority, my answer is yes. So, awesome job, Fire Emblem, for standing the test of time. I was definitely confused at first when I didn't see Roy, and the story played out like a puppet show. But it turns out that in the end, Fire Emblem, you were pretty damn tight after all. Looking at Fire Emblem from a completionist's perspective was kind of confusing because yes, it does have a bunch of stuff for you to do once you play through the main game once, but more than a lot of the other games I've played on this show, it really feels like it was all meant to be unlocked over an extended amount of time, purely due to the length of time one conceivably has to spend playing the game to actually get everything. So we already know that beating Ellawood's Tale unlocks both a hard mode and Hector's Tale, but not to mention the extra hard Hector's Tale you get for beating that once. But even more importantly, this unlocks some extras for you on the title menu in the form of the sound test, the CG gallery, the battle history, and the support conversation screen, which each track a different element for 100% game completion. First up is the CG gallery and the sound test, which pretty much do exactly what you'd expect. However, you don't unlock a cutscene or a sound before you see it in the game, and that means you have to play every single level in the game before it's done. And in the case of the sound test, you also have to go back through and make sure you hear every last piece of music in the game. From the sound that you hear from letting a character die to using a healing staff on the battlefield. It's a lot. At first, this was kind of daunting, and I was ready to check into celebrity rehab for digital influencers who started shows but didn't realize how much work they'd have to do. But then I realized that when it came down to it, all these screens was a group of checklists to track my progress. And then, I relaxed a little bit because at least I had a system, I had a methodology set up in front of me, right? Right? Actually, yeah, that is right. The tracks you unlock in the sound room, as well as the pretty pictures in the background, which you can see much better by pressing R by the way, are mostly there to make sure you do everything on every level. And looking into this little bit online was how I found out about the Gaiden chapters. Gaiden chapters are smaller side chapters with extra characters and story that you can unlock by fulfilling special conditions on certain missions, like beating it in a certain number of turns or talking to specific characters. There's only a handful of these missions, about 15 across all 3 characters, but they are pretty worth it to play through because they usually come with a pretty shocking revelation or they build out the lore a little bit and always feel like a little bit more than just a bonus. If you play every level and talk to everyone and do everything, by the end, you should have a full sound room and the ability to listen to every last sound in the game whenever you want. And you can even watch a slideshow of cool CG Fire Emblem art while you do it. Yeah, doesn't that sound awesome? Who's with me? Anyone? Come on, Sora Cross Sonic Fan 472, come on, I know you're there. No? That's because it's not really a reward, huh? Alright. Okay, cool. So, you have that thing. That kinda sucks. But then it's time for the motherfucking battle history and support conversations, and holy shit, by comparison, the sound room is Citizen Kane, because these things were the worst. On the surface, the battle history is just a simple little screen that tracks your performance and rates your skill as a tactician, with the best possible rating you can get being an S. S ranking is achieved by beating chapters quickly, keeping everyone alive, collecting a lot of items and gold, gaining lots of experience, and winning as many single exchanges as possible. Alright, so at first my train of thought was, okay, Fire Emblem, that's a lot of work, but you want me to be a good general? I get it, I can do that, I get it, that's respectable. But then I realized that you actually can't go back and replay missions unless you want to play the entire campaign again! You're gonna make me play through the entire game 4 separate times just to beat it all, and then I have to go back and do it all again without making any mistakes. Am I taking crazy pills? Is that... anyone? And I know some of you are going to say, hey, why didn't you try and perfect the game the first time through using a guide, huh? Well, in case you forgot, the game also asks you to do things like die and lose characters to unlock songs, and you can't get 5 stars with dead characters, can you? No, you can't get 5 stars with dead characters. And another thing, wait, no, are you crying? Are you crying? No! There's no crying in Fire Emblem! And that's not even all, because there's the damn support conversations. When certain units like each other very, very much, and they stand next to each other a lot, they sometimes can have support conversations to be there for one another. There's 42 characters, each character has like 6, maybe 7 different characters they can bond with, and 3 different conversations they can have based on what their level support is, which can be a ranking of either C, B, or A. For some characters, that means you need to get like 21 different conversations total, and getting all the way to A rank sometimes requires over 200 turns. Plus, you can only have 1 conversation per unit per battle, and you can only have 5 conversations total per unit per game, regardless of rank. That means you can have 3 level Cs, but if you want to have a B and an A rank conversation with that person too, that's gonna take up the rest of your slots, meaning that the max you can do with 1 character in 1 playthrough is 1 A level combo and another character that's a B level, and that's it. Dear Gerard, your job sucks. I hate you. Play me forever. Love, Fire Emblem! And hey, I know you're sitting there right now thinking about this insane math equation in your head, and guess what? It's burned into my freaking eyelids right now. Other than all of this, all you need to do to get that 100% completion is to find a super rare bonus disc that came out with Mario Kart Double Dash, which came out 14 years ago on the Nintendo GameCube. Then, connect it to your game, no big deal, and get a couple of sweet items in the last 2 tracks of your sound room. But you know what? Honestly, it might not be worth purchasing this item and having it shipped to your house just for the one purpose. Unless you don't have Mario Kart Double Dash, because let's be real, that's the best Mario Kart of all time. While this game is awesome, and there was a point in time just a few short days ago when I loved it, trying to beat this game 100% in a timely manner almost broke me. I'm a shell of a man. I am permadeath. In my completionist playthrough of Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance, there were 44 characters unlocked, 69 chapters, which include all of Lynn's, Ellawood's, and Hector's, including the doubles in Hector's and Genesis chapters, 96 sound clips unlocked, over 200 support conversations, several party members permadead, 58 hours of total playtime, and well over 100 times that I had to reload the goddamn game. Is Fire Emblem a worthwhile game? Yes. Should you pick it up and play it in 2017? Sure. Does it have great replay value? Absolutely. Some of the best on the console. But unless you turn this game on and play it and the skies open up and a beam of light shines down on you as you whisper, "This is the greatest game of all time that I've ever played and will ever play," I'd say it's probably not worth the days and days worth of real world hours it'll take you to be able to listen to every track in the game while looking at a bunch of CG renders of characters that I can just find on a Google image search. Play at your own pace as always, but even at that, I don't think the full completionist run is worth the risk.
For what it's worth, the story is incredible here in Fire Emblem. It's super engaging, the characters are really wonderful, getting to know them and how they work well together is one of the best components of the game. However, completing this game is a goddamn nightmare. I do not recommend it. You're going to be going through a lot of ups and downs with this entire journey, especially when you start playing hard mode, and even worse when you're trying to get the sound test out of the way and getting S rank on everything. Just take my word for it, play the game for the plot, the gameplay, and those kind of intertwined character moments. Everything else, you can live without. So, with that in mind, guys, I give this game my completionist rating of finish it.
Finish it!
That's all the time we have for today, guys, so please, as always, let me know what you thought about today's episode somewhere on the internet. If you liked today's video, give it a thumbs up and a comment, and let me know what your thoughts are down in the boxes below. A very special thank you to Norm, the gaming historian, who is the cameraman. Say hi, Norm.
Hi there.
You got Alex Bassiani on light.
It's 2 a.m.
It's 2 a.m. We're ahead, though, so technically it's like Thursday or Friday. In advance.
It's 5 p.m.
5 p.m. Yes. If you missed last week's video on Dracula X, give that a click down below. And if you're new here, you like what you saw, and you want to stay up to date to everything completionist and that one video gamer oriented, be sure to subscribe. That's it. That's all. And I'll see you guys back when I'm back in America and I'm getting a lot of rest. Let's go to sleep, guys. Oh.
I thought it was gonna be more theatrical if I
Sure.
like a story, but like
All right. You're good.
like a Mother Goose.
Yep.